and welcome back to the Beyond Broadcast podcast, a show which takes a behind-the-scenes look at industry professionals and their lives working in the broadcasting and entertainment industry. I'm very lucky today because I'm going to be speaking with Simon Bennett. Without a doubt, Simon is one of the most decorated director-producers in New Zealand television, with an extensive list of award-winning shows. Starting his career in the late 80s in theatre, Simon has gone on to work on iconic shows, developing stories and building worlds. Based in New Zealand, born in Australia and growing up in Sheffield, much like his work, he's able to pull from different influences and is a cultural chameleon, being able to adapt material for the stage, silver screen and television. Welcome to the show, Simon.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Now, we're going to start in the very early days, Simon, and it's where I always like to start. And in the early 70s, you were a massive fan of sci-fi and comedy. In particular, we can talk about Jon Pertwee's Doctor Who. You saw Star Wars 10 to 15 times. You were a massive fan of the Monty Python. These are elements that, in my mind, are quite theatrical and kind of show off your theatrical kind of debut, in a sense, from those early shows, which in my mind, I still see Star Wars as an opera in its own right, while other people say it's a straight sci-fi. Was this kind of like an early sign of your eventual career, this kind of interest? And the final question I'll ask is, who shot first, Han Solo or Greedo?
It's interesting that you asked that, because it's only in hindsight that I can look back on the things that I loved as a child and see the direct correlation with what I've ended up doing for a living. And, you know, the choices that you make along your career path that lead to what you end up doing as a career often seem like random coincidences along the way. And it's only looking back that you think, no, this was predestined. It was meant to be. I do divide my life when I look back between living in Sheffield, England with my family, and then emigrating to New Zealand when I was 9 years old. The TV landscape was quite different in the UK when I was there compared to in New Zealand. When I first got here, I think there was only TV1, and TV2 or South Pacific Pictures came along sometime later. And I think New Zealand had only just made the move to colour TV as well. So I grew up loving, as you mentioned, Doctor Who, but also Star Trek, the original series, which I used to watch with my father, and both Doctor Who and Star Trek terrified me. The scary pictures in the closing credits of Star Trek and the Daleks and the various monsters in Doctor Who, it really was hide behind the sofa, but compulsive viewing at the same time. I also loved the Jerry Anderson shows like UFO and Thunderbirds and Joe 90 and Stingray. And when I came to New Zealand, I think Space 1999 hit the screens too. So that was one strand of childhood influences. And the other, as you mentioned, was comedy. And that was something that my parents allowed me to stay up late and watch Monty Python on BBC Two. It was like, 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. It was very much a fringe, obscure show when it was first screening. And I remember just laughing uncontrollably at the surreal humor in that show, because it was completely surreal. It was comedy without punchlines. It was comedy without character. It was very verbally based, like language, and the distortion of language was a big part of what they did. And I loved that show. I also remember watching The Goodies, and I got hold somehow of the scripts to Spike Milligan's Goon Show, which was a seminal radio show from the 1950s. And I used to re-record the Goon shows on a mono cassette recorder, doing all the voices and sound effects live as I went. This was when I was about 10 in New Zealand. And that was another thing that I absolutely adored. So comedy was a big strand. I remember at school in New Zealand, primary school, I used to put on sketches at school assembly. This was in Form 1, Form 2, aged about 11, 12, I guess. And part of what I did was recreating sketches from the Two Ronnies or Monty Python. And another part was writing original material and coaching the other kids, dragging them screaming and kicking to perform with me on stage. And I loved that. And I found, or I believed, that I was really good at it. And it was certainly the most vivid and memorable thing that I participated in at primary school. Sport and I had no affinity for each other. And New Zealand has always been a very sports-orientated country, possibly even more so back in the late 70s, early 80s than now. And I was completely useless at any sort of sport, couldn't catch a ball to save myself. And so television, performing, and also reading were my big escapes.
It's interesting because you almost matured at an earlier age from the comedic standpoint, because you would have been bringing in stuff from Monty Python that wouldn't have even been screened in New Zealand at that point. So you would have been considered ahead of the curve at 11 years old. For a lot of other
Quite
people,
possibly.
Was it quite funny? Was it quite funny bringing that style?
It was funny bringing that style. I don't know what the other kids thought of it. I mean, you're right. They probably had never seen Monty Python. And when Star Wars came out, which would have been in late 77, I think, or maybe early 78, I was either in my last year at primary/intermediate or just about to start college. And it just hit me like an absolute, thunderclap. And I used to draw as a hobby, and I was always drawing and designing spaceships. And I used to love the lurid covers of pulp science fiction novels with their massive spaceships and epic space battles. And for the first time ever, it was realized in, seemingly 3 dimensions. Prior to that, most science fiction shows, they'd used 2-dimensional mats to depict spaceships. I'm thinking of 2001, A Space Odyssey, which was another film I loved. Like, my father took me to see that, I think, when I was about 8, which is probably quite young to be taking on Kubrick, but
Yeah.
It was hugely
Bold
influential. And Star Wars was just a watershed moment, and I saw it many times at the cinema with various friends. I dragged my parents along to see it, thinking they would be as blown away as I was, but they weren't. They thought it was a dreadful piece of rubbish. Basically, my parents were always very Anglophile, and anything American was seen to be dubious at best. And they wouldn't let us watch any American TV for my entire childhood, for example. And I think Star Wars was just too American for them. And also, you're right, it's a space opera. Well and truly a space opera. And it's got elements of soap. It's got elements of Flash Gordon. It's got elements of those kind of serial films from the 1940s and 1950s. And it's unashamedly pulpy pop culture. And I just got it. I clicked with it. And yeah, definitely Han Solo shot first.
I love that answer even more so. And I love the fact that you mentioned something that I can be reminiscent of as well in terms of my childhood, because my grandparents went to go see the new sequel trilogy with me, going to see episode 1, Phantom Menace, with me, and they said the exact same thing. This is trash. Why are you watching this? This is devilish, basically. They said it was unholy. And I was like, you don't understand how great this is. And I love that you had that retrospective moment as well. It was like you had that time and place, that moment with your parents where they probably didn't understand how important it was going to be for like the future of like cinema in many ways. Like it's interesting in that sense. And
I also remember trying to pirate it. I tried to pirate Star Wars on one of my visits. I took my Kodak Instamatic camera into the cinema and tried to take stills off the screen. Of course, it was way too dark for a very basic camera to be able to capture anything. But I also took a stereo cassette recorder with 2 microphones plugged into it to secretly record the soundtrack in the cinema. That was the level of my obsession.
I love that. And I'm curious because did you manage to keep those tapes for a while, or was like, did you end up like listening back to them and you're like, oh, these are so terrible, like they're not even usable?
They were pretty much unlistenable, really. I mean, I also had the double LP of the Star Wars soundtrack, which was much more listenable.
And I'm curious as well, did you ever make the jump back to Sheffield in between that time of you growing up, like the primary school years when you were in New Zealand? Or no, as soon as you moved over from Sheffield, that was you and the family set for life here in New Zealand?
My mother took me back to the UK when I was 18. So I'd spent half my life in New Zealand at that point. This was for a visit to see family and also explore old haunts and go to London and do all the sightseeing kind of things. So I did go back to Sheffield then, and we walked down our old street and went to various parks and things that we used to hang out at as kids, and looked at our old school through the iron railings. But I also went back in 2016 with my two kids, basically to share with them a bit of this is where I came from, because obviously I'd talked to them about childhood in Sheffield and the UK, and also theatre. I mean, I've been back to the UK a few times in between, but mainly centred on London and mainly for professional reasons, doing a directing course over there, and also seeing as much live theatre as I possibly could. But the trip with my kids and my wife in 2016 was really a sharing the UK with the two kids while they were still young enough for us to take them. And I went to Sheffield, parked the car outside our old house on East Grove Road, walked the walk I used to do every day to school with the kids, and went to the botanical gardens and the local park, and it was a fantastic sharing experience, just passing on, making concrete things that had only been abstract in conversation previously.
The thing I'm always interested to learn about, like especially people with the background that they've lived in another country, especially when they eventually move into creative fields, did you ever feel at that age that you were missing out on anything from being in New Zealand? Because at that time in the 70s and 80s, television, radio was very limited in terms of especially local content. There was only a very finite amount of productions that were being made. Was going back to Sheffield kind of like being like, oh, there's so much over here that I'm missing out on. Going back to New Zealand makes me feel like I'm culturally like missing out. Did you feel that at all, or no? Was it kind of not top of mind?
I didn't feel it on the occasions that I went back. I guess I did in terms of theatre, because culturally theatre is still much more significant in the UK than it is in New Zealand. In New Zealand, it's very much a niche activity that, very few people would say I go to the theatre regularly. But in England, stage actors are celebrities, and, every town has its theatre company and its local pantomime at Christmas. And there are many, many touring companies that tour the UK. So the opportunities for work in theatre, had I stayed in the UK and had I followed a similar career path, would have been a lot broader, but also there would have been a lot more people trying to do it. And, when I was younger, I didn't really think of myself as being an actor or director as a career option. It wasn't until I was at university, where I studied law initially, and I was doing a BA, I was doing a double degree, because I was good at English at school, and, not being into science or economics, I obviously wasn't going to go down that path. It was either sciences or languages. And if you're good at English and languages, then you're going to become a lawyer. So that was the obvious career path. But I did some drama studies credits as part of my BA at Victoria University. And it was another epiphany moment for me, where everything else just faded into insignificance. And I just loved theatre and film studies. And I promptly dropped the law degree and finished my degree doing as many theatre and film courses as I could. And then at the end of that phase, my lecturers asked me if I'd ever thought about being a professional director, because the third year production course involved us directing a 20-minute excerpt from something with full resources, as well as doing all the technical operation for another student's production. So we learnt about lighting and sound, as well as staging and directing. And so my tutors made that suggestion, and I think up until that point I hadn't even considered it as it was something I loved, and it was a passion and a hobby, but I'd never thought that it might be a career. And they wrote to George Webby, who ran Toi Whakaari, the New Zealand Drama School as it was then, and strongly suggested they look at me as a directing student. And so rather bewilderedly, I applied for drama school. They didn't have any directing placements, so they said, you've got to apply as an actor, which I did, and I got in. And so I trained as an actor at drama school in Wellington.
And I want to rewind a little bit as well because, and correct me if I'm wrong, you worked at the Sugar Club in the 80s, which I see the kitchen as almost being like a theatre in its own right. And much like what you said, you studied law. Law is very much a theatrical pursuit as well, appearing in front of a court, presenting your case just like a theatre actor. Do you ever see that the same systems and hierarchy ends up kind of existing in those same fields as well as in the kind of directing and producing sort of area?
Well, I grew up watching Crown Court. It was another one of my TV shows that I loved, which was a dramatized series of court cases. And, I used to find any excuse to fake an illness so I could be off school and watch television because I didn't like school very much. This would have been primary school days. And always used to love watching Crown Court. And I loved watching the barristers get up and make compelling and persuasive speeches that would move the jury to make the right decision, and the twists and turns of advocacy. But what I found studying law was that it was actually nothing like that. I imagine once you get into being a barrister and criminal law can be like that, but the law school training was all about being taught to think along particular, quite rigid lines, as well as a huge amount of rote learning and memorizing of case law. And it wasn't what I imagined it would be, so that partly contributed to me going off law. The working in the Sugar Club kitchen, I think, was expediency rather than theatricality. This was when it was Peter Gordon's first Sugar Club in Wellington back in the 80s. It was about being able to afford to flat and also afford to do co-op theatre back in Wellington in the late 80s, early 90s. So I was a dishwasher, worked in several restaurants as a dishwasher. I was a terrible waiter because that requires social skills and interacting with customers and not dropping plates or drinks. So I was much better in the background in the kitchen. And if I ever got asked to deliver a dessert to a table, the fight or flight instinct would kick in immediately.
But it's funny because Peter Gordon was well known for being like one of the first like real chefs to bring exotic cuisine into New Zealand. And much like that, you were looking for the exotic thing in terms of theatre, looking for something that the exciting cultural artsy sort of part. And one thing I want to touch on, do you think it was almost good in a way that you didn't get that director's placement at Toi Whakaari and you actually kind of learnt more about the fundamentals of acting and theatre in that sense to give you the kind of more, the second view from that perspective to be able to understand what is needed in an actor and what is needed in a director?
Definitely. I went into it with the mindset that if I train as an actor, I will understand what actors go through from a first-hand experience, which hopefully will make me a better director. That was my approach, but I didn't realize quite the 7 levels of hell that I would have to go through, because I'm an introverted person, and acting requires a lot of extroversion and a lot of relaxation in front of lots of people. And I was never relaxed performing. I had those "what do I do with my hands" kind of crises. I loathe dancing of any form. And I think we had like 6 different dance classes every week. Every day would start with an hour of super aerobics with Michael Parmenter by way of a warm-up. We'd have classes with Rona Bailey, who was a fabulous woman and a communist from way back. Like she was an icon in sort of social change in 1950s and 60s New Zealand. Lovely person. But she would put a record on and say, okay, I want you to move to the music. And my moving to the music invariably consisted of curling up in the corner in the fetal position. And I remember Michael Parmenter, who took us for, it was Afro funk classes, I think, turning to me at one point and saying, "You don't really want to be here, do you, Simon?" And I said, "No, not really." And he said, well, you're excused and you don't need to come to these classes anymore. So from that point on, I didn't go to Michael Parmenter's classes. And I think to his credit, he didn't tell the rest of the staff that I was no longer participating, because they did a sort of dance presentation to the school, which I wasn't part of. And there was some kind of raised eyebrows, I think, from some of the other staff. But I was so relieved. I mean, I do think I would have been quite a toxic influence in those dance classes with my intense level of, I don't want to do this, and this is absolutely crazy and horrible, emanating from every pore of my being.
So then what happened, Simon? Because if you've managed to avoid these dance classes that they had, you managed to kind of go under the radar so that no one noticed that you were avoiding them. How did you eventually make the shift into them, I'm assuming, opening up a spot for you to start directing and start going to this directing placement? Was it just a case of you caught them on the right day, or was it they simply saw what you had already and were like, that makes no sense for Simon to continue acting, he needs to move into this area?
They didn't move me into directing. I graduated as an actor. And you know, some things I could do. I certainly understood the texts that we were doing. Like I could understand a Chekhov, and I could play something that was verbally quite challenging. And they did give me some small additional directing exercises. So I would work with the class and direct. Jonathan Hendry was in my year, and he also had a directing interest. And they used to give us both directing bits and pieces to do. In my first year, I directed a play for Downstage in the Young Playwrights competition, which was a bit of extracurricular activity and keeping my hand in as a director. And my summer job between my first and second year was directing the Summer Shakespeare up at Victoria. I directed King Lear, which for a student was quite a big deal, but it was a wonderful experience, and I cherish my memories of that time very fondly.
Was it terrifying at all, taking on the reins of Shakespeare, or was it more or less like you're like, finally, about time I get to sink my teeth into something?
I was ridiculously overconfident. I wasn't scared. I've never been scared at the prospect of taking something difficult on in terms of the work itself, because I've always felt in my element when I'm directing. It's hard to explain, but I lose all self-consciousness. I feel like I'm flying. A day's rehearsal can go by in a blink because I'm in the zone, and I've always felt it's where I belong and it's what I'm best at. So it was an absolute pleasure. And my stage manager was Andrew Lang, who was a close friend at drama school and a flatmate. And so the two of us basically put all these poor university students through the ringer, teaching them the vocal and physical warm-up exercises we've been doing at Toi Whakaari, and tackling one of the great plays. And I still love King Lear. It was a great experience.
Is there any actors that you ended up working with quite early on in your career, Simon, that now have become quite big household names in the New Zealand space?
Yep. Robin Malcolm I was at university with her. We were in the same year at drama studies. And our paths have crossed many times over the years. So she was someone I knew from when I was 18. Playwrights Gary Henderson and Ken Duncan were at university with me. Katie Wolfe, who played Regan in my production of King Lear, Mick Rose, Rebecca Rodden, who became a playwright and co-wrote plays with Ken Duncan, Jonathan Hendry, David Geary. Lots of people from that time at Victoria went on to forge careers in the creative world, particularly theatre and writing.
Do you think because a lot of them cut their teeth in theatre rather than going into traditionally like into television and film, which it seems the direction of a lot of actors now, either go into one or the other direction, especially in New Zealand, sticking to only television or sticking to theatre. Do you think the reason why a lot of them have had such long careers is because of the fact they started in theatre and stuck to theatre for quite a long time?
I think theatre, because it's a much longer and deeper process of rehearsal, because you have to spend enough time on a text, like it used to be 4 or 5 weeks back then, in order to be able to sustain a 90-minute or 2-hour performance. Whereas in screen, film or TV, you're working on a scene that might be a minute and a half long. 2 minutes of it's a very long scene. So you don't have the rehearsal, you don't have the process of discovery and exploration that theatre entails. And I think actors who've grown up through theatre actually understand the types of questions to ask themselves and to the way in which to interrogate a text to squeeze interesting and rich ideas out of it that they can then incorporate in their performance. So it provides actors with a toolkit that actors who have only worked on screen may not necessarily have. So I think it gives people the ability to go deeper and further if they've got the talent. And I do think screen acting is a very different craft to stage acting. There are some people who are fantastic stage actors who will only ever be okay on screen. And there are some people who are amazing screen actors who could not sustain a performance on stage because they are different crafts. I mean, stage is about projecting to fill a room and allowing an audience in or sharing with an audience externally. And screen is about letting the audience come to you, very often through the eyes. So it's about a much more heightened inner life, whereas stage is more external.
And we'll definitely get into more technical stuff later on, Simon, because I'd love to touch on that. And one of the things I really loved hearing about and listening to was one of your earlier projects that you got to work on, and this is moving through to television, which was the German market-made Riding High, and involved a lot of crazy things, stunts, animals, kids, which, from what I've been told, is the worst combination for anyone who's choosing to work in television and can be the most high-pressure sort of work, especially with quick turnarounds. What did that experience teach you about high-pressure productions? Because from what I saw, it was incredibly short production time that you had to get a lot of work in.
You have done your research. I don't know where you dug that up. Riding High was my first screen directing job. I'd done a 3-month director training course that South Pacific Pictures had run because they were looking for New Zealand directors to work on Shortland Street. There were 3 work placements at the end of the course, and I think there were 6 directing students and a whole lot of writers, so it was competitive. And 2 of my cohort went straight onto Shortland Street, and I got seconded to Riding High. I think because it was more difficult, I don't know. Riding High was a combination of location and studio, about 50-50, and Shortland Street was each block of 5 episodes, I think, was 3 days studio shoot and 1 day on location to shoot 5 episodes. But what South Pacific Pictures had learnt through their connection with Grundy TV, who had helped with setting up Shortland Street because they had expertise in fast turnaround soap production, were the systems and the techniques of making fast turnaround telly. But that model didn't really apply to shows that incorporated children and animals and stunts and locations. It was really designed for multi-camera studio shooting where you'd be switching between cameras and you'd complete a scene in 15 minutes and then move on. That was what that system was designed for. Anyway, I think South Pacific Pictures sold the idea of this German kids comic adaptation called Riding High. We were assured it was only for the German market. Don't worry, it will never be seen in New Zealand. Of course, it ended up in New Zealand. There were very mixed abilities in the acting area, particularly with kids. It was completely unachievable in the time frame that had been allowed. I remember lunchtime meetings where the producer would sit in a circle surrounded by all the crew, begging everyone to finish the day on time and not incur overtime because they were so over budget and behind schedule. And it was just impossible. But I learned a huge amount I was attached initially to a senior director as a watch and learn and direct occasional scenes position. And then after a couple of blocks, I was given blocks of my own to fully direct without supervision. And I really enjoyed learning how to do stunts. They were very basic. I enjoyed working with the younger and inexperienced actors because I had the theatre background. I'd been working for 10 years in theatre by that stage. So the one thing I did know was how to help actors realise their performance. And I understood how different actors need different things from a director to help them overcome a block or an obstacle or to make sense of a script. So I was good at that. But also, I'd always been a photographer, an amateur photographer. It was always one of my hobbies. I had a camera from about the age of 9 and loved taking photos. And so I did have a visual sense, I think, which you need for screen directing. And so I took to knowing where to put the camera and devising shots quite easily. Animals were always a challenge. They still are a challenge because they're unpredictable, particularly things like horses. But there were so many elements to juggle on that show that for me, I discovered that directing television was like being perpetually in a theatre technical rehearsal where all the elements are coming together. It's just before the dress rehearsal and you're sorting out lighting cues and sound cues and positions on stage and costume issues and lighting issues. And as a director, you're having to multitask and have like 5 or 6 different things on the go in your mind at the same time. And television directing is just like that in terms of the state of mind you have to be in when you're doing it. So I found I had an affinity for it and really enjoyed it. I didn't, and I never have had the same passion for screen directing that I had for theatre. And I think that's because I started out in theatre, and it's always felt like home to me. It's a world where I feel completely comfortable. Very often, the material that you're working with is more challenging than it is with screen material, and I like the depth with which you can go and the time that there is for playing and exploring and trying things out. Whereas with screen, you're going straight away for the end result because you haven't got time to muck around. And the crew certainly don't want to be standing around twiddling their thumbs while you explore options within a scene. You've got to work it out very quickly so that you can start the filming process.
One word I want to jump on there, Simon, is you've used the word challenge a lot, and I feel like challenge is what you're always setting yourself, a challenge to the next one, seeing where it's going. And in that respect, did you see some of the child actors that you were working with and the direction you're having to give them sort of like a blank canvas? You got to mold them on set because most of the time they wouldn't have the experience that older actors would have, and in a way was training you to be better at your job in the future?
I think by the time I was working with child actors on Riding High, I was pretty experienced as a performance director. So I wasn't learning a lot, but I felt that I had the ability to help them. I don't like the idea that a director molds actors. I think actors are creative artists in their own right. What a director can do is help unlock things for an actor and show them possibilities that they might not otherwise have considered, as well as the technical aspects of you need to bring your eyeline this way or the camera can't see you, or you're masking this person, or you need to use your voice a little bit more because the microphone can't record you when you speak that quietly. Those kinds of technical considerations. But from a performance process point of view, it's not molding. I think some directors, traditionally, old school directors, saw their job as being molding actors and actors being blank slates. And, there was a ghastly philosophy that said that a director's role was to break down the actor so they could rebuild them, which I think is an appallingly abusive power imbalance kind of dynamic. And, I think in any creative endeavor, we're collaborators. I mean, the director's job is to lead because someone has to make the final decisions and someone has to say, this is how we're going to do it. Otherwise, it would take much longer. But as much as possible, I see directing as facilitating, provoking, prompting, stimulating, and challenging people's imaginations, because you're dealing with a lot of highly skilled, creative people, and it's an imaginative field. And for me to assume that I could mold people and do their jobs for them would be a very arrogant approach. And it's one I've never taken.
I'm glad that you touched on that as well. And one mention would be obviously the Kubrick style, which seems like he does love psychologically breaking people. On another aside as well, I'm curious about this, and because I may have misheard it. Is it true that while shooting Riding High, you had to be very particular about the scenes themselves and what were being shot, and that horse poo couldn't be in a single scene while shooting? Is that true? And for that reason, why was that?
That is absolutely true. And it was something to do with the German television rules. You know, it was being made for a German network. I can't remember which. And that was one of the stipulations. It was one of the edicts. Everything had to look pristine. There was no mud, there was no dirt. And it may be because the audience was children and it was based on a very wholesome series of comics. I don't know. But that's something you get in television is your client, the person that you're making the show for, often has particular ideas that you have to honor. Like Power Rangers is another case in point. We used a lot of footage from the Japanese Super Sentai shows, which was, part of the way Power Rangers was made and evolved, as a lot of the more expensive material was lifted straight out of Japanese show. And because the characters are masked, you could just overdub American voices and rewrite a different story around it. But a lot of the Japanese footage was way too in your face for Nickelodeon, for the American TV network that the show was destined for. So there were all kinds of rules, like you can't have characters on fire, you can't have penetrating injuries, you can't have execution-style killings. And this is a show that is all about fighting monsters and martial arts. It is a show about a form of very stylized violence for kids. So we spend a lot of time in visual effects changing fire and explosions to purple or green and calling it a magical effect as opposed to something that was burning anyone. Penetrating injuries had to be masked with laser bursts so that you couldn't see sharp things, all that kind of stuff. So that's an example of following the rules set by the client network.
It's funny that you mentioned that, and I'm sure we'll go back to the topic of Power Rangers, because I actually did some voice recording work for a voice actor who worked on Power Rangers, perhaps maybe even when you were working on it, and I'm sure we'll talk about this off air, because I'll be quite keen to figure out if there was the correlation. But it's interesting because, you touched on the challenges, and we'll go back to challenges again, because at Shortland Street, which you eventually started working for, you learnt a lot about fast-paced multicam directing, and that is a completely different style to what you've been doing with Riding High. It was probably your second big TV opportunity with screen directing. You did writing for Shortland Street as well. The pace is completely different. And also, from what I understand, Shortland Street was a bit innovative in the sense where it was one of the first shows, was it not, of kind of moving forward in that sort of style. Was it kind of a little bit you're writing blind when you were working on Shortland Street, or do you feel like there was an element of you were very prepared to go into this? How did you feel jumping onto Shortland Street? Because it must have been a completely different beast.
The directing course that I'd done prior to Riding High, run by South Pacific Pictures, had very much focused on multi-camera directing, because its main purpose was to find New Zealand directors for Shortland Street. And quite a few of us had theatre backgrounds, because the philosophy was you can teach the technical side of multi-camera directing, but performance direction is something that requires experience. You can't teach that. And traditionally, I think a lot of screen directors had come up through the technical side of things. Maybe they'd been a first AD or a director of photography or a camera operator, and they knew nothing about performance. So In screen, the dominant idea was actors do that acting stuff and you just tell them where to stand. And the job is all about composing the shots and putting the cameras around them. But there was very little help available from a performance point of view for actors. But back to Shortland Street, I did know the basics of multi-camera shooting. Shortland Street, as I mentioned before, was based on the Grundy's model, which they'd used for young doctors and various, neighbors and Home and Away. They all used this fast turnaround multi-camera shooting technique. So it wasn't new, but it was new to New Zealand. Previously, close to home had been a long-running soap that had been made by TVNZ at Avalon. And I think they only made 2 episodes a week, maybe 3. I think it was only 2. Whereas Shortland Street produced 5 episodes a week. So you had a location week and a studio week. The location week, you had 2 shooting days, a Monday and a Wednesday. One of those days would be out on location. The other day would be around the studio, exteriors around the studio building and a few studio scenes. But the studio week was the big one. So you'd rehearse on Monday, you'd shoot on Tuesday, you'd rehearse on Wednesday, and you'd shoot on Thursday and Friday. And the idea of rehearsing was locking down the blocking for each scene, producing a camera script for each scene, which would then get published. And so when you were shooting, ideally all you were doing was recording the scenes that had already been rehearsed based on the camera script that had been published previously. So from a directing point of view, you are editing in advance. On your camera script, you mark on the script where all the cut points are, what the shots are, which camera has which shot. And in the control room, a vision switcher is switching between the cameras live. So it's a bit like theatre in that the scenes are played live and they are cut live according to the director's camera script, which I quite enjoy. It's very intense. The workload of having to camera script 160 scenes in 2 days is pretty intense. And then when you're shooting, a normal scene would be 15 minutes to shoot. A bigger, more complicated scene that might be a party scene with 10 or 15 actors in, you might have half an hour for that. But it was challenging, and I've found the challenge fun because I always have done, and it was intensely technical, which I also have always enjoyed. So I found I took to it, and I directed Shortland Street for a year, which would have been 96. And in 97, I was offered the producer job on the show, which again was a whole lot of new stuff for me to learn because I hadn't produced television previously. So what else can I say about Shortland Street? It was challenging, but I like challenges. I think for me, still, if there's nothing to learn in a project, I don't really see the point in doing it because learning and growing and acquiring new skills and encountering new things is part of what keeps it interesting.
And you did keep it interesting because then you moved on to become the head of drama at South Pacific Pictures, which you gained a bit more insight into the business side of things, commissioning. Also, you ended up probably taking away quite a few lessons in terms of how the New Zealand television kind of industry works from a higher level. In terms of, like, for you, was it a bit of an internal kind of balance or internal fight trying to mix the corporate side of things with the creative instincts you probably had from those earlier years? Or did you find it quite easy making that transition and being like, I can understand both sides of the fold without it being conflicting?
When I moved into head of drama, I had to learn about the broader sense of how the industry works, the politics of the industry, relationships with the commissioners within the networks, how New Zealand On Air works, how the Film Commission works, funding, international sales, that kind of thing. But that wasn't my main focus because John Barnett very much ran the company with his hands on. He was a business brain. And he was very, very good at the business side of film and TV. My role was mainly creative, but it was a creative overview. I was working with the writers on fine-tuning and developing the scripts. I continued to be involved in Shortland Street, but arm's length. I was an executive producer, and that involved being a sounding board for the then producer, but also watching the cuts of a block at screening every week and giving notes and feedback on that. I also was part of the liaison with TVNZ. It was kind of a diplomatic role, really. I would have to translate the sometimes intense disapproval that came from the client on a show to the producers and makers of the show in a way that wouldn't completely demoralize them, but would allow changes to be made that would satisfy the needs of the clients. So it's that kind of thing. There was always a tension for me between that executive producing arm's length role and the hands-on making stuff job, which was what I loved. But I was allowed out of the office to direct while I was in that job, because I think John understood that otherwise he probably wouldn't be able to keep me, because my drive was really towards directing and making. So while I was head of drama, I also directed across 5 seasons of Outrageous Fortune, which I was also an executive producer on. I think I directed 23, maybe 25 episodes in total. And I produced produced The Almighty Johnsons, which was a show that I really enjoyed. That was towards the end of my time as head of drama. I directed Sione's 2, Unfinished Business. I produced Madigan's Quest, which was a kids' fantasy show, which I really enjoyed. The whole world building aspect of that, and working with great designers like James Atchison, Gary Mackay, and Tracy Collins, and bringing an imagined world to life, and Margaret Mahy's fantastic imagination. Loved that show. And that was why I didn't end up directing the first Sione's Wedding film, which I was slated to direct, was because at the point that got greenlit, I was completely immersed in Madigan's Quest, and I had to make a choice. It was either one or the other. And I went with Madigan's Quest because I was too far into that to be able to walk away. So those are examples of things that I did to keep my hand in creatively, while also at the same time maintaining the overview of all the projects that the company was working on. It was quite a workload, because even while I was shooting, I was also juggling emails and communications and meetings on other projects. Like, I think when I was producing Madigan's Quest, the first season of Outrageous Fortune was also happening, plus a show called Diplomatic Immunity, which was a short-lived procedural cop show, plus Shortland Street, plus Sione's Wedding. So there were those 5 shows happening at the same time. I was producing one of them, but I also was across the other 4.
Simon, did you sleep?
Not
Ever?
much. Not much. I remember adding up the hours during that Madigan's Quest time, and I was working 16-hour days, which I could only do because I absolutely loved it. It's almost an obsession with me when I'm working on something. It's not. It's never felt like a job. I continue to be amazed that I get paid to do the thing that I love most, and that I would do for no money if the opportunity arose anyway. It's a bonus, but to have been able to make a career out of it is just fantastic.
I'm also intrigued by the idea of commissioning. It's not really a world I have a great understanding of, and I feel like this is probably the ripe and perfect time for me to ask this. Because, as you mentioned, as head of drama, you oversaw a lot of those projects. You'd probably be seeing the different scripts and various projects that would be coming in. Was there anything that you felt that came across the commissioning table that you wish had been produced, that you had to turn down for various reasons, whether it be the clients felt like it just wouldn't work for the screen, or you felt like it was too ambitious to be able to do at that time? Was there anything that you kind of look back on now and you're like, man, I wish we made that? Or do you think there is a possibility it could be made in the future?
There are a few projects. Yes. I mean, South Pacific Pictures had a well-developed development department because they had they had the resources of Shortland Street behind them as an ongoing backstop, which actually gave them the ability to have a full-time development department. And a lot of unsolicited ideas would come in, like maybe 30 or 40 a month. And those were all sent out to assessors who would give their feedback on them. And then the ones that showed the most promising potential would be discussed at a meeting, once a month. And at the same time, we would reach out to various experienced writers saying, TV3 are looking for something for men 18 to 49 with a comedic aspect, or, that's an example, because the networks always knew what they were looking for to fulfill their commercial needs. So we would approach writers and ask them to come up with ideas. And often writers like James Griffin or Rachel Lang or Gavin Strawn would come back to us with a list of 5 ideas, like just be a paragraph on each of them. And we would look at those and think, that's got potential. Oh, that's really interesting. And so South Pacific Pictures would then option those ideas and get the writers to come up with a bit more information. And that would then be pitched to the network. And there were always ideas that never made it. I remember there was a Roger Hall play called A Way of Life, which was based on 3 or 4 generations of a farming family. It was a tragedy that I directed the stage play of, and I always saw that as having potential as a epic TV drama series going from the First World War through to the present day. And we did develop that to the extent that I think it was broken down into outlines for each episode, but we never found a home for it in terms of a network. So that never went anywhere. I remember Rachel Lang, James Griffin, and Gavin Strawn had some fantastic ideas. There was one idea about old people reborn in young people's bodies through some kind of sci-fi treatment process. I can't remember the details of it, but I remember thinking, oh, that's really cool. That could make an amazing show. Almighty Johnson's was one that was a very high concept series, and I was frankly quite surprised when TV3 gave it the green light, because normally most adult New Zealand shows had been grounded more in a recognizable reality than Kiwis being descendants of Norse gods with various supernatural elements, which did end up being one of its problems in that I think the network wanted it to be much more down to earth and everyday and less supernatural. But the writers very much wanted to follow through on the supernatural idea because that was where most of the stories came from. So there was a real tension on that show between what the network wanted and what the creators wanted to do. And also it was hard on the heels of Outrageous Fortune, which had been a huge hit. And Almighty Johnson's wasn't delivering the same figures that Outrageous Fortune had, which caused a great deal of consternation from the network particularly. It also coincided with the downturn of broadcast television as far as viewer figures are concerned across the board, and it's never been the same. I mean, nothing has achieved the kinds of numbers that Outrageous Fortune achieved, and that's because of the amount of competition in the media landscape now. People just are not watching free-to-air broadcast television in the same numbers that they used to. But that shift, or the beginning of that shift, coincided with Almighty Johnson's. So, and it's amazing that it made it to 3 seasons. I was fired after the 2nd season because the ratings weren't good enough. And also, I think I was perceived as not following the network's edicts creatively strongly enough. And we kept coming up with stories about mystical powers and Norse gods, whereas that wasn't what they really wanted. So I was the fall guy. I took the blame for that, which I was devastated about. It was one of the big knockbacks of my career, really, because I loved the show and I thought it had so much potential.
I'm so glad you brought up Almighty Johnson's because I felt like it how do I put it? I felt like they could have ended season 3 in a better way, and I felt like it died a slow death that it shouldn't have died. I felt like it was such a great idea. It was so creative. It was so innovative in terms of what it was doing. And the other thing that frustrated me to no end is the fact that probably the thing that stole a lot of the ratings was the Big Bang Theory, which frustrates me to no end. I think
it was on at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was done such a disservice in terms of the timing it was put on. And the thing that always astounds me is because before we spoke, Simon, I actually ended up looking at Almighty Johnson's, and friends of mine had seen it. It aired in Canada, it aired in the US. Do you think that in this time now, if Almighty Johnson's had been released and put out to streaming, do you feel like it would have had far greater success than compared to what it had maybe on free-to-air television in New Zealand? Do you think it could have gone across borders?
I do. I think if it was for an international streaming service, it would have had more money. It would have had a higher production value, which would have helped. But I do think it is exactly the kind of high concept show that a company like Apple TV, Apple Plus, TV Plus, are making huge amounts of money out of. I mean, you look at something like Severance, for example, another very high concept show, and it absolutely had legs. And also, when your market is global, a niche idea actually equates to huge numbers of people. Whereas if your market is only New Zealand, a niche idea is not commercially viable. And, when a show is sold internationally, it's licensed. The international broadcasters pay a license fee, but it's small change compared to the cost of actually making something. Whereas if you actually are commissioned or make something for a global audience, the amount of money available to make it is much higher. Yeah, you mentioned about season 3. That's interesting. I didn't work on season 3 because I was kicked off it at the end of season 2. And I think season 3 was very much made with very close monitoring by TV3. Season 3 was the show that TV3 wanted. 1 and 2 were not. And another interesting thing about Almighty Johnson's is that after the very last ever episode of Outrageous Fortune, which I directed, when it went to air, even before they went to the closing credits, they played a promo for the Almighty Johnsons, which was billed as being the replacement for Outrageous Fortune.
Yes.
And I think that immediately alienated all the fans of Outrageous Fortune who did not want to see their favorite show finish. And Outrageous Fortune had been hugely popular, and to actually shove down their throats that their favorite show is being replaced by something else created an automatic antipathy towards that replacement show. So I think that was a stumble as far as marketing is concerned.
I couldn't agree more, because I do remember that, and it's still to this day, I remember the last episode of Outrageous Fortune. To me, it's kind of like that seminal moment, like the last scene in The Sopranos. I still remember, and to be fair, Simon, I lived in Auckland for a bit, and I visited that house, and just still remember that scene. It's the oddest thing how much of a cultural icon that show became, and that house in itself. And one thing I'd love to kind of go in a little bit more in depth about is you described Rachel Lang and James Griffin, who were the main writers on Outrageous Fortune, as being like the Lennon and McCartney of a collaboration sort of duo. Like, why is it that you feel like those two have just got such a in-depth connection with each other in terms of writing?
I think Rachel and James have very different writing sensibilities, a bit like John Lennon and Paul McCartney. I mean, Paul McCartney wrote the sweet melodies and the beautiful love songs, and John Lennon's writing was angrier and a bit more caustic and scathing, and was much more grounded in blues and early rock and roll. So musical versus raw rock and roll come together, and you get a lot of the Beatles. Rachel and James. Rachel is a fantastic writer of relationships. Her background was in relationship drama. I hate to use the word soapy because it's a bit derogatory. I mean, Mercy Peak, she'd come off, which I also directed a lot of, and that was very much a relationship-driven story about a city doctor moves to the country, but fascinating characters, all with their quirks and flaws, and very clear and consistent wants and needs, and a great dramatic situation. So Rachel writes romance and relationships brilliantly, and James writes satire and hard-edged comedy, and he has quite a cynical tone and sensibility, and an eye for the outrageous, implausible, and absurd. And you combine those two very different writing skills, and you end up with something like Outrageous Fortune. And also, when you've got two writers that are so different but also highly skilled, then they can critique each other. So they each prevent each other's excesses being made to the screen. There's kind of an innate, built-in self-editing process, which results in great writing, I think.
Do you think that's why there was such a strong male following for Outrageous Fortune, which you've seen in an interview before, that you felt it was strange how many people were into this drama, something that is traditionally a drama, a show that men are following, which drama is usually seen as something that the younger female audience would be more into. Do you feel like that's where it's kind of almost resonated with more people because of the fact there was, as you said, that balance where there was no extreme on either or? It was kind of like it managed to capture both ends, and that's also why, even with the kind of excessive, I guess, and I'll say this not because it's a bad thing, it's just I rewatched some of the Outrageous Fortune episodes recently. I was like, there is a lot of sex in this show, more than I can remember. There's a lot of drugs, violence, and everything else, but it does it in a way that it pleases both audiences. It's not an extreme on both ends. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Like, you feel like it was able to pull that both in?
I think that's right. I think it did work for both audiences. And it is a cliche, but the statistics and the ratings would tend to support that women generally are the watchers of dramas, particularly romances, and that men traditionally are into action and sport. And I think Outrageous Fortune offered enough to keep the men hooked in. It still had strong relationship stories in it, which worked for the female audience. But I think characters like Van and Jethro and Wolf and Munter and Eric and just the people behaving really badly caught the fancy of a male viewership. But beyond that, I think it also captured something that was quintessentially Kiwi, that whole West Auckland bogan culture. Everyone recognized the truth in it. And I think they felt that it was not self-conscious and it was unpretentious, and it reflected a New Zealand that a lot of people recognized and thought was authentic, although obviously the plotting was heightened and the situations and the comedy were extreme at times. And it was unpredictable too. You never knew what was going to happen next. And some of the extremes that it went to were very extreme, as you say. As a director, this was in the days before intimacy coordinators existed to help out with the navigating the sex scenes, to help the actors and the directors, specialists in that area. They weren't around back then, so it was hard as a director. And I felt at times quite uncomfortable working on some of those scenes. And I've really felt for the actors in some situations having to put themselves through that kind of material. It felt that there wasn't enough of a safety net emotionally.
Do you think a show like Outrageous Fortune could be made now in today's environment, or do you think it would kind of be a bit considered too controversial, or do you feel like it still would work, and if anything, it would probably be more popular now?
I think it would work now. I think it could be made now. I just think there would be more structures in place within production to make it a bit safer for the actors having to deal with that kind of material. I think the whole advent of the intimacy coordinator as a role is a brilliant thing. And that's because as a director, I've experienced the awkwardness and the vulnerability and the ickiness of trying to put together sex scenes with actors that does or has in the past made me feel uncomfortable and exploitative. And, when you've got actors who sometimes might not be necessarily terribly supportive of each other, because they might, for example, feel that the actor that they're working with shouldn't have been cast in that role because they might not be as good as the other actor, and then you have to put them in a sex scene. All acting requires trust between actors, but when you're dealing with exposing material like that, it requires a whole new level of trust. And that's where I think intimacy coordinators bring known techniques and processes to choreographing those scenes, and don't expect anything of the actors that they haven't already rehearsed and or feel comfortable with. It's all about serving the story. It's all about telling the story, but it's in a way that is respectful and professional. And back then, we didn't have those structures in place. There was quite a lot of mind games going on between the actors as well, you could say.
Yeah, because I didn't even consider that in terms of like the actors themselves potentially making it uncomfortable, and not necessarily the directors or the production team, because, yeah, as you said, it's vulnerabilities in every way, and it is quite competitive, the whole acting industry as a whole, and of course it is, because there's only a finite number of roles, and there may be people who feel threatened, among other things. And yeah, I just appreciate you saying that, Simon, because I think it's maybe an area that isn't often talked about. It is now. Maybe at the time wasn't really something that was explored even then, and it's good to know that you were even considering that even at that point. It's a bit of an aside for what we were talking about, but can I just ask, Simon, because it's one of the things that has always stayed with me with Outrageous Fortune as well, and we'll move on to something else, because if listeners haven't already figured out, I'm a massive fan of the show and a lot of the early work that you were doing, Simon. How important was soundtrack to Outrageous Fortune? Because I felt not only did it tell the story in many other ways, but the fact that your production company chose to only use New Zealand music, I know that was probably because of New Zealand On Air funding and because it was a lot cheaper to license music from New Zealand. How important was it for you to use music in that way and for using it to push the story forward as well?
It was really important, and it's partly because James and Rachel and I are all huge music fans. So it was an opportunity to use music that we loved in the show, and also to discover new music, because I think Franklin Road were the music supervisors on Outrageous Fortune. And what they would do is they would give us a hard disk of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of New Zealand tracks that they had pre-cleared, which meant that we knew we could use these tracks for a particular pre-agreed licensing rate. Because one of the issues with using music that you haven't cleared is that you can fall in love with a piece of music. Like, I want to use a Queen track in this film, for example. And then the holders of the rights can have you over a barrel. You either pay the thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars that they require, or you can't use the music. Whereas we actually had an extensive catalogue of New Zealand music that had been pre-cleared. And we spent a lot of time in the edit working out what the most appropriate songs were to use for particular moments. Like, I remember Aurora's death, Aurora and Van's song. I think we had about 3 or 4 different options, and we watched them all in the edit, like the scenes with the different musical options. And James and Rachel and I all agreed on the one that we ended up using, which I think was an Opshot track from memory.
Ordinary Day from memory.
Yeah, that's right. And I discovered Phoenix Foundation through Outrageous Fortune. We used quite a lot of their music as well. It was basically whatever worked from this huge library of pre-cleared music that we had. And I think we made I think there was an Outrageous Fortune CD published. And I remember James Griffin writing the liner notes for the CD and being so thrilled, because all his life he'd wanted to write liner notes for a music. And we're all music nerds. Like, we all have extensive music collections and have been through the whole album, cassette tape, CD, streaming, changes of generations. So it's just a part of the creative side of making a show that really tickled our fancy. I really like working with composers as well on original music for shows. And there was a composer on Outrageous Fortune, but most of the music was licensed existing tracks.
I'll be really self-indulgent, Simon, and mention the fact that I did have that compilation CD. It was literally one of the first CDs I got as a kid. And also, I think the fact that you used Be Mine Tonight by the Dudes, and not only season 1, but as the final song to feature on it, was probably the best choice that could have ever been made to finish a TV show. I just have to say that.
That was my choice. That was my choice on the final episode, because we knew it had been used previously. And to me, it was quintessentially the West, that song, and it has a celebratory note to it, but also kind of an aching sadness at the same time. It just works so beautifully for the party, and then Cheryl standing alone on the balcony, that last image. I love that song. I just adore it.
It really is the perfect song. And I want to move forward because we talked about it and touched on it a little bit, and I didn't realize that you were originally earmarked to be directing Siona's Wedding, the first one, which I think both are equally as iconic in terms of how they've been. And one thing I'm really interested about Siona 2 is the fact that you were tasked with taking a different sort of take, or you kind of put it in that direction of taking what was considered like a comedic film, but giving it a bit more of a serious edge and a bit more of a serious story. And you've said in other interviews that you felt like it was almost like the audience didn't quite understand the direction you were going for, and in a sense just wanted a repeat of what they saw the first time. And I've seen the second one, and I think it was interesting that it was taken that way, because I rewatched it recently and I don't understand kind of where this kind of take was, in terms of people saying, oh, why did they make it so sad and depressing? I felt like that was kind of where it needed to go. Like, it would have felt like too samey if it just had been the same sort of feel.
It's interesting making a sequel to something that was a big hit. It's a bit of a poisoned chalice. I think Chris Graham did an absolutely fantastic job with the first Siona's film. I mean, he, as a filmmaker, was very much immersed in the whole hip-hop world. He'd made a lot of music videos. He understood the culture. He understood the music much better than I think I could have. So I was picking up the job of making a sequel to an incredibly successful film. I wanted to do it because I really wanted to make a feature film, and I hadn't done that before. And I loved the performers. I loved the Naked Samoan team that were behind it. Like Oscar Kiteley and James Griffin wrote the scripts together. And I really wanted to work with them. It was difficult. It was not received nearly as well as the first film. I actually objectively don't think it's nearly as good as the first film. I think the first film had a sort of joie de vivre. It had a sense of fun and joyousness and childlike quality and a simplicity to it that just resonated really, really wildly. The second film was always called, its temp title was Siona's Funeral. So the first film was Siona's Wedding and the second film was Siona's Funeral. And John Barnett said you cannot have funeral in the title of a film because people won't go. And he's probably right from a marketing point of view, although I did try and point out 4 weddings and a funeral, which had existed at that point.
I was about to say that.
But anyway, so it was called Siona's 2: Unfinished Business, which to me doesn't make any sense at all, because Siona's 2, it's kind of like an industry shorthand for a sequel. But anyway, the script, because it revolved around Siona's death, and finding Bolo, who felt responsible for his death, in time for the funeral, and also unpicking the serial philandering that Siona had been engaged in. It basically, the philandering sort of demolished the character, particularly from a Pacific Island point of view. It made him not a fine, upstanding character at all. And the death and the funeral created an overlay of sadness, which I always felt when we were working on the film also added a layer of triumph and togetherness to it. Like the moment when the friends are carrying Sione's coffin out of the house to the hearse, and the music, the choral music kicks in. I always found that a really moving moment. Um, but it had some funny moments, but it didn't have the level of hilarity that the first film had. And the other thing I kind of knew about it at the time was that it felt a bit like a radio play. There was lots and lots and lots of talk and dialogue and not much action. They were either sitting in a bar or sitting in a van or sitting in a house, but there wasn't much actually happening apart from the basketball scene at the beginning. So it didn't feel it had the same energy that the first film had. I did my best with it. And I'm still proud of it because I think it holds up, but I honestly, objectively don't think it's nearly as strong as the first film for all the reasons I've discussed. And then I had to weather the brunt of having directed the film that wasn't the success that the first film had been. And I remember John Barnett saying to me when the reviews started coming out, "Oh, I should have warned you about this," as if he knew that the sequel would never be regarded in the same light as the original film. And he probably did know that and didn't think to warn me about it. Because unless it's Toy Story or Star Wars, sequels are rarely as good as the very first film.
Yeah, it's tough, and interestingly, it was kind of an early precursor to a lot of what I would call the New Zealand style of comedy films now, which is underlying sadness, and a lot of it with elements of comedy, like the Taika Waititi sort of style of comedic, sort of dark, tragic comedies. It's almost like you already foresaw that and kind of made it work. So that was the thing that I always found confusing going back to it. I feel like it needs to be revisited because I feel like it does hold up in that sense. And I love the fact that you had that take on it, Simon, that you kind of just, you were working with what you had and you made it work to the best of your abilities. I think that's really interesting.
The other thing I really liked about the film was that it took place literally in my backyard. I was living in Grey Lynn at the time, and all the locations were within about a 1 kilometer loop of where I lived. And so putting places like the K Road motorway overbridge, all the locations in that film were places I knew very well from life. So I did see it as a love song to my neighborhood, which used to be very much a Pacific Island neighborhood, but obviously when we made the film was becoming gentrified and now is completely gentrified. And I think Albert has a line in the film about because he now lives on the North Shore. If I had a spare $1 million, I'd still be living in Grey Lynn. Of course, that is a pittance now compared to what a house in Grey Lynn would cost. But it was a tribute for me to the last vestiges of the old Grey Lynn central city area.
It's funny you talk about the Grey Lynn sort of area. I lived in Eden Terrace, which it was like just around the road from the Media building, and the house that I lived in, it became quite a well-known local haunt for musicians. The house itself was barely standing up, then weirdly the house next door burnt down. It was used as a location in the TV show Step Dave, and even now it's surprisingly still there. I think I paid $50 a week to live in it. There were rats constantly in the place, but people used to come and we used to do shows there. So I totally get what you mean. It's like Auckland has changed completely, even in the last 10 years for me. And it's nice that you kind of got to have that like still picture image of, your old neighborhood and kind of have it, it will still be there in time. I love that. And you mentioned also a TV show that I absolutely adore, which is Severance. And I feel like you almost took that style yourself, Simon, with Blue Rose. You experimented with slower burning storytelling where you're keeping the audiences in the dark. And one of the things I would love to know about is what are the challenges of keeping viewers engaged when the payoff isn't immediate? Because I feel like that has definitely been the case with shows like Severance, where it took to the end of the second season before you had any idea as to what was going on. What challenges did you feel you had with that and the Blue Rose? Because I can imagine it would have been immense.
Blue Rose, well, I was a director for hire on a couple of episodes of that. It was after I had left the South Pacific Pictures job, so I wasn't intimately involved with the writing or the creation of that show at all. I do know that it was another example of, it was Rachel and Gavin, I think, wrote Blue Rose, of balancing a serious story with comedic stories in order to create an interesting effect. And I, at the time and in retrospect, I'm not sure it was as successful as Outrageous Fortune in doing that. You had the group of the Blue Roses, the secret society of lowly office workers who were solving crimes and mysteries, and there was also the overarching intrigue thriller story that went through the whole series. But I think tonally, they were too self-contained and different. It felt like two different shows to me working on it. And I felt that, and it only went to one season, and this may be partly why, is I felt that the audience who were hooked by the intrigue story got a bit frustrated with the comedy story, and vice versa. I don't think they were quite integrated enough, those two different styles of threads. But to answer your question about a show like Severance, I think what keeps the audience watching is two things. It's intrigue. It's keeping the questions alive in the audience's mind, so they want to know, they want to understand, they want to find out why and what, but also having very vividly drawn characters that are interesting and compelling, and that the audiences either like or hate and want to spend time with. Those are the two things that, and it's easy to say that because it's a very hard thing to do, but Severance is brilliant at that. And also, there's a certain geeky appeal for people who like surreal worlds and world building, because it is its very own self-contained universe, that show.
And a question I've always been curious about is New Zealand productions often face a challenge of competing with much larger international budgets. And how do you approach making the most of limited resources while still delivering world-class storytelling? Because I can imagine that must be one of the things that, and I'm sure it's the case with any creative working in television in New Zealand, is how do you deliver a similar product even with the limitations?
Well, you actually can't compete in terms of production values, because a lot of those high-end international shows, the budgets are 50 to 100 times more. And what that equates to is time. They'll spend more time on lighting and shooting and rehearsing those episodes than we could possibly afford to do. We still work on quite a fast turnaround model compared to the international shows. And, a high-end international show, they might do 2 shots a day. They'll block the first scene, they'll spend 3 hours lighting it, and then they'll come back and start shooting. We have an hour from beginning to end on that scene. So although we have a very highly skilled industry in terms of crews, and heads of department, many of whom also work on the big international shows, the reason they choose to do the New Zealand shows, I think, is because they want to tell New Zealand stories. They feel an affinity for the content. They feel that we should be telling New Zealand stories. And people accept a much lower pay rate to work on New Zealand shows very often, and smaller budgets. But there is a sense of, this is our story for our audience that is a reason for people to want to do it. In terms of your question, how do you compete? You can't really compete. What you can do is you can put time and effort into the writing so that the stories and the characters are recognizable by the audience and are compelling enough for the audience to want to keep watching them. And they might forgive the fact that it doesn't look as lush or as beautiful as some of those international shows. Having said that, I think we are more and more making shows here that are on a par with a lot of international shows. And that's because most of the dramas that we're making in New Zealand now are international co-productions. So money comes into them from offshore. They're designed very often for streaming services, and there are eyes on the show that are overseas that have eyes on many other international shows that are affecting the quality of the shows. But what happens in that kind of, the downside of that kind of situation is that you lose some of the unique New Zealand voice and culture because it is being filtered by and for an international audience very often.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that stayed true to me with, especially like your projects like Outrageous Fortune, is it's so uniquely New Zealand, it can't be repeated. It's why when attempts were made to try and remake it in the US, it just flopped immediately because it was its own thing. It's unique to that identity that can't be repeated. And I think it's always quite funny trying to see attempts at any New Zealand show being remade because it just never seems to equate. Yeah.
There was an American remake of Outrageous Fortune and a UK remake, and neither of them captured the lightning in a bottle that the New Zealand show had. I think part of that is the chemistry of the cast that we had in New Zealand. They were exceptional, and they were independent and bloody-minded. And a lot of the magic of Outrageous Fortune was the level of improvisation between those actors when we were working out the staging of a scene. Those scenes were not blocked in the traditional sense. Like I would come in as a director, I'd say to the actors, you come in here, let's see what happens. And they would play, and I might have to nudge the staging just a little bit so that I could shoot it within the time allowed. And then I had to very quickly, having watched the playing of the scene, come up with a shot list. Like, part of my brain would be watching the storytelling and performance, and part of my brain would be thinking about the shots. I'd say to the DP, these are the shots. And the cameras were handheld on the shoulder, 2 cameras, which meant, and the operators were self-focusing. So it meant that they could be in the thick of it with the actors. If the actors did something different, the camera operator would accommodate. So it was, which gave the whole thing a much more organic feel to it, and it felt more real. Whereas the traditional way is very precise. Actors hit marks, particular times, or focus pullers. It's not quite the same level of anarchy that was behind. When I say anarchy, it was imaginative. It was intelligent, it was creative anarchy, all focused on making this as good as it can possibly be because everyone loved it and felt very strongly about it, but also never ever wanting to be boring. I'm not going to do that. I've seen it before. Let's do something different. And that very much informed the mindset of the lead cast on that show. And it was great. It was fantastic, which is one of the reasons I think the American and British adaptations never quite got it. But I also think that nowadays, as you say, there might have been an audience on streaming services for the New Zealand Outrageous Fortune. I think the whole idea of we sell the format and let other countries make their own version is a little bit backward looking. Why don't we celebrate what we can do? Assume that people's ears will adjust and come to grips with the New Zealand accents, because that's always been one of the perceived hurdles to New Zealand shows, is that people in the States or the UK won't be able to understand the New Zealand accents. That's why very often, if you see a New Zealand scientist or something being interviewed on a US show, they'll be subtitled.
It's something I can still not understand, and I think it's interesting now because we are seeing like a dramatic shift from the formats being changed to suit the country more, especially on streaming services now. You're seeing like international hit shows that are completely in their native original language. There isn't this expectation there needs to be a dub, because more often than not, the dub is terrible anyway. It's better to just watch it with subtitles and get the context and understand the feeling from the natural actor's performance. I don't know, like I'm just thinking of things like Squid Game, for example. To move forward to another area, and we won't touch on this for too long, Simon, but you have always had this love of sci-fi, and it's interesting that you worked on Power Rangers. I feel like I have to mention it a little bit. How did that even come about? Because this is the thing. I can't fathom how you got approached by this, or whether you were the one that kind of went across to them. How did that project come about, and what was the scenario? I'm just trying to imagine it myself.
Well, after I left Pacific Pictures, I was a freelance director. And it's hard surviving as a freelance director. So little actually gets made in the country anyway. You have to do a lot of hustling and knocking on doors and emailing and contacting people and keeping your ear to the ground about upcoming projects, which is kind of where I find myself at the moment. But I approached the Power Rangers producers and said, I'm a director, here's my CV, I'd love to work on the show. And because a lot of the crew I'd worked with on earlier shows had also worked on Power Rangers, and they'd said, you should do Power Rangers, you'd be great at that. So I didn't know much about it. I binge watched a few episodes before my interview, so I knew what the show was. And I was brought in for an interview with Chip Lynn, who was the American executive producer of the show. And we talked for an hour, and I must have said the right things because I got offered a directing gig. And I directed 4 years across 2 seasons. And at the end of that time, Chip decided he wanted to go back to the States for family reasons, and he shoulder tapped me to take over from him as executive producer. And I think one of the reasons for that was one of the challenges for directors on Power Rangers was being able to read Chip's mind. You had to, as a director, realize the scenes and tell the story in the way Chip, as the showrunner, had imagined. And he would come to the block through of most scenes and make sure that what you were doing met his vision. It was very prescriptive and strict like that. And I think for some reason, I could read his mind or visualize what he intended. And, 19 times out of 20, I would get it right. And so he thought, whether rightly or wrongly, that I was the obvious successor because I got the show as he understood it. And also because of my experience as a producer, I knew about all the various other aspects of making a TV show, the development, the writing, managing other directors, and also all the various post-production areas I'd had experience in. And, I approached it with a huge amount of enthusiasm and wide-eyed innocence. I had to learn about the whole genre and the whole show itself, which had its own very peculiar set of rules, which took me a while to kind of understand, because obviously it had at that stage, I think, 22 odd years worth of history. And by the time I finished, it had been going for 30 years. So it was a very well-established machine and quite unique. Nothing else quite like it. So I was executive producer / showrunner for the last 4 years of the show. I managed to direct the finale of the first season that I EP'd, which was joyful. But the thing about Power Rangers was I learned a huge amount about visual effects and action and working with the second unit, as well as with liaising with people in the US and Canada and where the various clients and the production company were based. Because during my time, it was sold by Haim Saban to Hasbro, who then set up or bought the production company E1. So its ownership kept moving around. And, every year I'd be dealing with new people, brand managers and production heads, all of whom had their own particular ideas about what the show should be. So I was, constantly changing sands, trying to please and deliver what was asked by the various different changing masters. And then eventually, very sadly, Hasbro, the CEO who bought Power Rangers, the franchise from Haim Saban, died. And the new CEO very much had a policy of sticking to the billion-dollar brands. And the more peripheral brands were kind of retired and Power Rangers was one of those. So it ceased to be a priority for Hasbro and is now just a licensing opportunity for them. They're not really interested in investing in production anymore.
And that's the side of it that I found kind of interesting, because essentially Power Rangers, the original Japanese version, was set up as basically an elongated toy commercial for the purpose of selling toys to kids. And is it kind of challenging trying to find a way to, because much like you said, there was a history of 20 years of like a lore that you had to pull from. And is it kind of strange to think about it in the sense that a toy commercial became this very established universe that had this incredibly huge fandom? And like, as you said, you had to have almost the blinkers on. There were rules that you had to follow when you're writing. Was it quite like tough in that sense, trying to make sure you maintain those rules? And not only that, we're still like listening to the heads up as well, like the higher heads of the studio who were saying like it needs to be this particular as well to fit with the branding and the franchise itself.
It kept it interesting for sure. I mean, one of the problems was that, yes, there was 26 years of lore, but there was no consistency between them, because every 2 years, the show would be based on a different Japanese Sentai season that had no connection to the previous Sentai season. So each season of Power Rangers that we were making had its own story, its own set of characters. But the loyal fans, who might have been kids when the show first started, but were now very much adults in their 30s, created or tried to create various connections in order to imagine a consistent history and lore of the show, even though in the writing there wasn't one. So part of what I tried to do with Becca Barnes and Alwyn Dale, who were the head writers and co-producers on the show, was fix some of those inconsistencies to kind of rewrite the continuity a little bit, so what actually didn't make any sense had a kind of logic behind it. And the other thing I found myself doing was listening to a lot of the fan discussion and feedback about the show online. This is the adult fan base I'm talking about, and found myself agreeing with quite a few of the critiques of the show and wanting to adjust the show in a way that answered some of those questions or concerns, but also didn't alienate the core audience for the show, which was actually 4 to 6 year old kids. I mean, that was the target audience that I was briefed to make the show for. Unfortunately, there was a very vocal minority who were adults who had very strong opinions about the show and had watched it since their childhood, so they were deeply committed to it, who are constantly commenting, campaigning, talking. So even though they weren't the core audience, some regard had to be paid because they were influential and vocal as far as whoever was currently running the show on behalf of Hasbro or E1 at the time.
Was that something that was kind of unexpected? Because I feel like that's a lot of the issues that anyone who's a showrunner or a director for example, we touched on very early on the Star Wars franchise. I can think of, in particular, Tony Gilroy, who took on the show of Andor, which, to be fair, is one of my favorite iterations of Star Wars content. And a lot of people, it's the same thing. I saw seeing people crying about it, saying, it was only 2 seasons, it was so good. Is it kind of like do you wish you almost had a warning prior to taking on that role that there would be this kind of deep-seated people that wanted to see it one way rather than another and would take it personally almost, that you weren't delivering what they wanted?
It wouldn't have changed my decision to take it on. What I would do differently if I had the opportunity again was I wouldn't engage with the fandom online. Prior to Power Rangers, I'd always had a sort of relationship via Twitter predominantly with the audiences of whatever show I was working on, whether it was Outrageous Fortune or Almighty Johnson's. I used to enjoy live tweeting while the show was playing out on air and answering questions. And that was because I think with screen production, you get very little immediate feedback. So you're totally reliant on your own instinct and you're creating an artifact that once it's made, it's made. Whereas with theatre, which is my background, you can sit in an auditorium and you can feel how the audience is reacting to the work from moment to moment to moment. did that joke work? Was there a big laugh? Is the audience on the edge of the seats? Are the audience a bit bored? You actually can sense that in the room. So I used to enjoy getting immediate feedback from the audience as a show was playing, because it would help inform my decisions going forward about what worked and what didn't for that audience. So rather naively, I engaged with the adult Power Rangers fandom in the same way I had on previous shows, without realizing what a complicated spiral of criticism and sometimes toxicity it could be. I mean, there were some people who were fantastic and constructive and helpful, and there were other people who were extreme in their reactions. And if I had much time on the show again, I would not engage at all with the fan base. It's too big. It is too committed, and it is too, I think, inflexible. And I'm sure it's the same with Star Wars or any of the other pop culture artifacts that have significant online fan bases. Online discourse leads to extremism, I think. And I think this is just one example of it. I mean, look at politics at the moment. There's another example, and that's not what this conversation is about, but you just have to look.
There is no greater hatred of fans than Star Wars fans that hate other Star Wars fans, and purely because of the fact they say you either take yourself too seriously or you're not taking it seriously enough. It's this like constant conflict between the two areas. So I find that really interesting that you say that. And I think it was interesting that you opened yourself up to that dialogue. And I think, if anything, you might say naively, you shouldn't have done that. But in the same respect, I think it's interesting that you were open to that dialogue. And I think many of the fans who did love your work on Power Rangers would probably thank you for the fact that you did do that. And it's funny because I did look at Reddit threads and other various things that talked about you and said, like, it is refreshing to be able to talk to a director and writer or someone who's involved as a showrunner and be able to get like a direct comment back, like saying like, thank you for watching the show. I thought it was beautiful, and it's a shame that a couple of people ruined that kind of experience for you. And I hope obviously going forward, that maybe those people do think about kind of the way that they acted, because they're probably never going to have that with any other showrunner in the future.
Unfortunately, I was in charge at the point that the plug was pulled on a 30-year-long season. So I will always, in some people's eyes, be connected with the fact that the show was cancelled.
Well, Simon,
that's just something you live with.
That's all right, mate. You can say that you're the devil to the Power Rangers fans. If anything, it'll be kind of hilarious in a sense.
The thing is that I loved my time on the show. I really enjoyed it. I was working with good people. It was a out there kind of show, and I was really proud of what we achieved, and I remain proud of it to this day. So there's kind of a strange disconnect between my own experience and perception of the show as a 4-year, actually an 8-year period of creative commitment, and some of the reception I got. But them's the breaks. We work in popular culture. We can't control what the audience thinks. All we can do is make something, put it out there, and hope that people enjoy it.
And that's that final line I really want to go on to, because in 2019 you chose to produce Merrily We Roll Along with Toi Whakaari students, a famously difficult musical, which when it first came out on its first run flopped massively. There was high expectations behind it, and you were mental enough to kind of draw yourself into that project and think, you know what, I'm going to take students and tackle this project, which has been known to be incredibly difficult. Why is it that you chose to throw yourself into the rungs and put yourself on the hot coals and be like, you know what, I'm going to give it a go?
I think because it's been one of my favorite shows for forever. Musicals, I mean, that's another thing. And, Shakespeare and musical theatre are two of my great loves, and I've been lucky enough to direct in both those areas. So Stephen Sondheim, I think, is a genius on a par with Shakespeare, and the opportunity to engage with the work is the most stimulating thing for me that I could possibly do. Basically, with both Shakespeare and Sondheim, possibly Chekhov as well, you can dig and dig and dig and never reach the bottom as far as exploration goes. And that's what makes these people geniuses. They understand the human condition, and they write characters that are so rich and stories that are so profound. Also difficult, not immediately readable. It requires work and requires a very deep engagement to fully appreciate, I think. I love Sondheim since about 1990, when I was first introduced to the shows. I used to listen to them. I had all the CDs, listen to them obsessively. I was lucky enough to be able to direct Into the Woods and Assassins at the Watershed Theatre in Auckland with wonderful professional casts. And I always wanted to direct Merrily We Roll Along. Partly because it's challenging, it goes backwards in time, but also the themes as well as the music resonated deeply with me. It's a musical about people losing their idealism and becoming cynical and becoming swamped in the creative industry and losing friendships and their sense of selves. And it goes backwards. So you start with the characters at their most, the three good friends at the core of it, not being friends anymore, the final falling out, no respect for each other and the choices they've made in their lives. And it goes backwards to the point where they first meet and they're young, idealistic writers and composers, where the world is their oyster. And there's something about that backwards trajectory. It's ironic and it gives me the shivers. It's truthful, and there's some of his best music, I think, is in that show. So anyway, Toi Whakaari, which is my old drama school, which I'd been on the board of for 8 years or so, asked me if I would like to direct the second year production. And they'd done a musical the year before, and they said it's a musical year, they can sing. What would you like to do? And I just jumped and said Merrily We Roll Along, because it had the right number of characters for that size group of students. But also it was a show that I'd all my life really wanted to direct. I've got a bucket list of shows, 3 or 4 of them, that if I ever get the chance to direct, I will be very happy. And that was one of them. Another one is Company, which I've yet to do, and which I don't think anyone will give me the opportunity to direct, but I would love to do a production of Company, another Sondheim musical. So yeah, basically, long story short, I was given the opportunity. I proposed one of my all-time favorite shows, and I got the chance to direct it with that year of Toi Whakaari. And the great thing about working with drama students is because they've all worked very closely with each other over a couple of years, there's a sense of ensemble there. They all trust each other. They've all got a certain skill set, and you can get an energy and a freshness and a level of trust and risk-taking that you don't normally get with a cast that might have just been brought together for one show from various disparate places. So it was a rare privilege to work with the Toi students.
Do you also feel like there was a sense of irony because you're taking them on the story where it's people lose their idea of creative spirit and there's a cynicism, and you're taking these students who are at the beginning of their creative journey and maybe going through their career. Maybe they're at that point now since you've worked with them, Simon, that maybe they're cynical. Is it kind of like ironic that you had that sort of group in that sense?
There is a bit of that. Like I've in my career path in my life, I was definitely at the beginning of the play, i.e. older and wiser and a bit more cynical, and they were all at the start of their careers. But in a way, it made it relevant to both of us and a bit of a cautionary tale for them. I'm not sure how into it all of them were. I think the year had wanted to do Hamilton, which I also love as a show, but has... I don't think Toi would ever have got the rights to it, and also it really needs to be all the cast need to be filled with people of colour, and that wouldn't have been the case with that year of Toi Whakaari. But anyway, I found it a very enriching experience, and I think some of the students did as well. And it was a learning experience, which for me is important. That's why I love tackling the really difficult shows if they're well written, because you learn through doing them.
And something that I found really interesting is that you've worked with a lot of the same crew on various shows. One person in particular that you've mentioned is Tracy Collins, who you've known since 1991. And it's interesting because of the fact that you've taken them to so many different projects. Is it something that you've found yourself doing, that you found it important to surround yourself with people that know and understand your vision going into shows? Or is it something that just kind of happened, like without real rhyme or reason?
I think what it is as you move through your career, you work with lots of people, and the people who you click with, who you feel an automatic affinity with, whose work you admire, and whom together you make something that is bigger than either of you could do on your own. It's that kind of thing. I mean, Tracy is a production designer. She's also a theatre set designer. She's also a costume designer, and she's an artist in her own right. And I worked with her first time on a production of Taming of the Shrew in the Watershed, 1991, as you say. And we've come back together time and time again. I brought her into film and TV design as costume designer on Madigan's Quest, and she's gone from strength to strength since. These are all people who are extremely good at what they do, so you know that they will deliver, but also people with whom the creative exchange is rewarding. And it's not so much me imposing my vision, it's a conversation and a collaboration, so that what comes out of that collaboration is interesting and surprising and appropriate. I mean, there are other people like that too. Victoria Kelly is a composer who I would work with again and again because I think she's brilliant. Who I first worked with in theatre with Midsummer Night's Dream and A Way of Life and King Lear. But also, I've worked with her in TV. She was the composer on Madigan's Quest, one of the composers on Almighty Johnson's. She's now composing for the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra. She's a wonderful composer. So I'd worked with her time and again. There are lighting designers. There are first ADs. There are in every area. The more you do, the more you know there are people whom you're on the same page with. There are some people who you don't necessarily connect with, but they still do a perfectly adequate job. And there are some people who, no matter how hard you try, you just don't have a creative connection with. And they're the people that you generally avoid working with again, just because it is not a freeing or particularly creative process. You need people who trust each other, who can engage collaboratively and produce extraordinary work. That's always the aim.
And one thing I'd be interested to know is, going back to kind of the producing, directing, writing side of things and show running, how much does understanding your audience play a part in terms of the eventuality of the story itself? Do you feel like it needs to be the core thought when you're coming up with any creative project, or do you feel like sometimes it is having that creative thought developing yourself and the audience kind of becomes a secondary thing of like, how do we make it work for the audience? How do you kind of develop an idea in that way?
I think it depends. I think that if you take on a project, film, television particularly, always have to have the audience in mind, because it's generally a commercial medium, which means that in broadcast TV particularly, their business is delivering an audience to advertisers. So you have to make something that is going to usually fit into their most lucrative demographic as far as being able to charge the most for advertising slots. So that always needs to stay in your mind, because if you lose that and you deviate, then you're not fulfilling the brief and the show is not succeeding as far as the client is concerned. And that's probably the problem with Almighty Johnson's for me, is that the show I was responsible for was not matching the network's idea of what their audience wanted or expected. And that's the kiss of death in commercial television.
And with a
I
lot
think
of ideas as well. Another thing I wanted to touch on is you talked about in another interview how it's important when you are writing a project or going through an idea that you try not to take influences too much into your work, and that if anything, you should try to avoid copying anything, but there is still the chance or the opportunity to have echoes of that sort of main idea or that main love that you have. Where would you say is the biggest reflection that you have of echoes of something that you love, but not directly copying it, but still managing to have it kind of sitting in there sprinkled over in terms of your work?
I think we are always a product of our influences. We grow up watching and absorbing and listening. Um, I've lived a life of books, theatre, films, TV, comedy, drama. That's been my main art, visual art. Those have been my main creative influences. And even though I might consciously not try to copy something because that would be plagiarism and feel derivative, you can't help but be influenced by all those formative experiences. So I think any artist or creative person is a product of their experience, whether it's stuff they've lived or it's stuff they've consumed. So for me, if I'm working with material that someone else has written, I'm trying to get inside that material and I'm trying to bring it to life in a way that is relevant to that material. If it's a world building exercise, then I'm brainstorming with the other writers, or I find it hard generating anything on my own. I always need at least one other person to bounce off. Partly laziness and procrastination, but also I think more than one imagination. You can, as I mentioned with Rachel and James previously, you can self-critique each other, comment on each other and keep each other to the knitting. But also in that bounce, there's a spark and things that neither of you might have foreseen happening can happen. I can't think of anything I've done which has been consciously derivative of anything else. And that's because I always consciously try and avoid doing that. It's one of my core values. And unless I was given the task of making a sequel or an episode where the rules have already been strongly or firmly established, like Power Rangers was a bit like that. There are certain tropes that you absolutely have to go with because they're embedded in the material. And I guess to a lesser extent, Sionis 2 was a bit like that because the world and the characters had already been clearly established. The story was different, but the genre and the audience's expectations were already clearly there. But I can't think of anything I've done where I have deliberately tried to reflect or echo something else, because to me that would feel a little bit dishonest, like you're stealing someone else's idea. And in our industry, there's always a risk that inadvertently you take someone else's idea without realizing that you're doing it. And that does happen, I'm sure, quite a lot. Because as I said before, we are a product of our influences. But I think everyone who has integrity tries very hard not to do that.
And Simon, I'm coming to the end of the chat, and the final question I have for you is, you mentioned challenges a lot. Everything is a challenge. You like to be challenged. You like to see something that is difficult work. What is your next challenge for yourself? Where do you see the next challenge, and what is the next challenge for Simon Bennett?
My next challenge is finding or generating some work, to be honest. It's been 2 years, more than 2 years, 2 years in July since Power Rangers finished. In that time, I was a director for hire on a couple of episodes of My Life is Murder, which would have taken 6 weeks. And apart from that stint, I have not been gainfully employed. And what I have been doing is developing new work and new ideas of my own. When Power Rangers finished, because that had been such an intense process. All my energy had been channeled into that project for a long time. When that was stopped, a whole lot of ideas came flooding out. So I developed a number of ideas. There's a play I'm working on with my writing partner. I've had a comedy series optioned by a production company in Wellington that the two of us have come up with. There are 3 other shows that haven't found a home yet, but we would love to see come to fruition. There's an opera bubbling away in there somewhere. So it has been about writing and generating, but because these are unsolicited ideas, finding a home for them is tricky. So if one of those ideas could actually find funding, get greenlit, and be made, that would be absolutely brilliant. And I've also been working for the last 18 months on developing an epic series of book adaptations in the fantasy paranormal romance genre. And I was working very closely with John Barnett on those, and very sadly he passed away about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it was his production company that was sponsoring the development. And it's all very up in the air at the moment where that sits and what's going to happen next. But I would love to see that come to pass. I was attached to that as showrunner and director, and that would be 8 years worth of work, aimed for an international streaming audience. Significant production. So I can't really go into any more details than that.
Of course.
If that could be resuscitated and brought to life, that would be just brilliant, because it would be a huge step for the New Zealand industry. It's New Zealand IP, and again, it would be a big challenge in a very exciting way.
I can't imagine how scary it must be, Simon, in the sense where it's like seat of your pants. And one thing I wanted to touch on as well is because you mentioned the longevity of the Power Rangers work. Was it almost like, did it feel strange when it ended, and then you're coming off the back of that, and it's just this whole moment of like sheer intensity to coming back to kind of being like, I now have the time to myself to almost think? Because I can't imagine what it would be like rolling through, like, obviously production and getting to that point where you're like, okay, now I have a moment to actually kind of recollect myself.
It wasn't quite like that, because I could see the end coming. It wasn't a complete surprise. Like, we knew when we were developing Cosmic Fury, which was the last season, that it would probably be the last, just because of the way things were looking in the States with the parent company and things. And also, I had a year's worth of post-production after production finished. So I was purely in visual effects and sound post land for the last 8 or 9 months. So I had more time on my hands than I would have had previously, when we would have been in production on one series, starting to develop the next, and in post. I'd have those 3 areas all going at the same time. So I certainly wound down with Power Rangers over time, and was thinking about, what do I want to do next? And my wife and I did some travel, which we'd always planned to do, and then came back, and I launched into developing ideas. Unfortunately, the economy here is not that great, and worldwide there are a lot of question marks hanging over the industry, to do with tariffs and various other things. Also, the writers and actors strikes in the US, as well as post-COVID, have all affected certainty and filtered down through the industry. So we're in quite a lean time at the moment.
And I feel bad because I just said final question, but this will be the final question. What trends do you see happening in the next, say, 5 years in terms of television production? You talk about the fact that it is a difficult time for TV production at the moment, even from the general sense of international productions as well, I'm guessing, because the streaming audience has meant that audiences are deviated in so many different directions. So being able to helm an idea and guarantee an audience can be difficult. What are the trends that you see for the next 5 years? What do you think is going to happen in the next 5 years in television production, film production, streaming, everything in between?
A lot of it's linked to politics, to be honest, and I don't think I could predict what's going to happen politically. I think if the current political climate continues in the next 5 years, I think there will be the pulling back of local storytelling and production will continue as terrestrial television becomes less and less relevant to people and the audience gets older and older, which is a trend that's been happening for the last 10 or 15 years, but seems to have reached crunch point. And I do notice that a lot of the scripted shows that are being funded at the moment are very low budget, like extremely low budget, which means that the people who are making them are subsidizing the work pretty much. And it also means that not a lot of people are going to end up seeing those shows very often. I think the future probably lies in continuing to make higher end content for the international audience through the streamers. But there is a problem, which is that as a business model, the streaming service actually doesn't work particularly well. It's all about generating new subscriptions rather than the audience that each show is reaching, because it's not an advertising-based model, it's a subscription-based model. And I think that the market is pretty saturated as far as subscriptions. I mean, what's happening now is that a lot of people are surfing from service to service, like signing on for a month because they want to watch a particular show and then canceling that subscription and signing on to something else. But I don't know that the cost of high-end production is being met by the revenue that's generated by subscription yet. I think that there's a lot of investment in the streaming services based on the promise that it might hold, but I'm not sure the business model has been proven to work. So I think that the screen industry is very much at a crossroads. I don't know where it'll go. What I do know is that as human beings, we will always want stories. We need stories. They help us define who we are, how we fit into society, how we deal with our mortality, what the problems, crises, and decisions we have to make in life are. You know, stories are an essential part of being human. And I think that they will find a way of continuing to be told. I'm confident of that. And the storytellers will always exist who need to tell those stories. I just don't know quite from a business point of view how that's going to work. But then I'm not a business person. I'm a storyteller fundamentally. So I tend to leave the business and political side of things to other people whose strength that is.
If you like the podcast, I'd love for you to leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform and let me know your thoughts on the show. Don't forget, you can reach out to me via Instagram at BeyondBroadcastPod or via email at beyondbroadcastpod@gmail.com. Until next time, take it easy.